Monotype.
Hi everyone, welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people designing the future of creative work and shaping our culture. I'm Carl, and this is Bill, and we are your hosts.
Hi Carl, and hi everybody. We may be a little biased, but we both think that Monotype is a really fascinating place to work. We provide typefaces and technology to some of the biggest brands in the world and to individual designers that need them to do their day-to-day work.
Yeah, and as a result, we get to talk to the people designing at the cutting edge of their fields. And each episode will bring you a conversation with one of those people.
We will ask them about how design is changing our world, how culture is evolving, how trends in design are shifting, and perhaps most importantly, how creative work is being done. Today we're talking to James Sommerville, the co-founder of Known Unknown. He's been designing for over 30 years and has a tremendous experience with brands like Virgin, Adidas, and Coca-Cola. Carl, you got a chance to talk to him. A big honor. You got to do our first interview on the Creative Characters podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, James and I talked a lot about what creative work looks like today. Obviously, the pandemic changed things in a major way. So we sort of talked about what it looks like now and what it will look like in the future. And what struck me is that James has a lot of compassion for designers as a designer himself. He really understands the struggle of balancing work, life, and the challenge of making ends meet while doing something you love.
He also does it with a lot of style. He's got a very soothing voice, very comforting, something we all need right now. So I think I'm really going to enjoy it, and I'm excited to share it with everyone. Before we jump into the interview, we just want to remind you that this podcast is about sharing the stories of some really interesting people who have built successful design careers. If you have questions you'd like us to ask future guests about their stories, about the future of design, or about how you can build a successful career for yourself, please hit us up with an email at podcast@monotype.com, and you may just hear your question on a future episode.
Hi, James. Welcome to Creative Characters.
Thanks, Carl. I'm excited to be on the show. Look forward to getting into the conversation.
So let's start simple. For people who may not be too familiar with your work or need a little refresher, who are you and what's one of the more intriguing things that you've been up to lately?
Great. Yeah. So my name's James Sommerville. Born in the UK, came out of design school, had a kind of a teenager and kind of finished the art college there, studying graphic design. I founded an agency quite young, the age of 19, and grew that agency over 20 plus years. And that was a great chapter. And then from there, I went client side and I was at the Coca-Cola Company as VP of their global design. So that was a 5-year stint on one of the largest brand stages. And more recently, I've moved on again to the third chapter, which is to sort of launch a platform for design talent around the world.
And if I'm not mistaken, you have an interesting connection to Prince Charles?
Yes, absolutely. So in the very beginning of my agency, which was called Attic, and it was founded in my grandmother's attic bedroom, we were two students that were really trying to get a business off the ground with my friend and business partner, Simon, and the Prince's Trust, which is a charity in the UK, and to help young people start their entrepreneurial careers. They supported us with a grant of £2,000, which was, I guess, was our seed funding at the time. Mm-hmm. And that allowed us really to officially open our doors and to really kickstart our agency life. Didn't seem like too much money today, but back then in the mid 80s, it was like, I felt like we won the lottery at that point.
What's the last 6 months been like for you, sort of dealing with all of the upheaval and changes going on in the world related to coronavirus and shutdowns and all that stuff?
Well, I think, for everybody, the pandemic has absolutely transformed our lives in every corner of our respective worlds. So I think from a kind of a purely professional standpoint, We'd already made the decision 2 years ago to focus on a 100% distributed creative model. So in that sense, it wasn't a huge shock to be working from home. We'd already been kind of crafting those skills on, life and work balance. So I think, if anything, what it's allowed us to do this year is really, see the potential in a platform for us that will, no doubt, many people will be looking at their future next year, the year after. From a kind of a creative community perspective, we're seeing much more people now come to the forefront and potentially make themselves available to a more on-demand, kind of fluid, dynamic model in the way that we're trying to build our current business.
So it sounds like you were fairly well positioned to make this change, but like, has anything surprised you, like even on like the minutia of day-to-day work from home life, or in that response from the creative community? Like, have you been pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised by anything you've experienced or observed?
I think it's like many other things that I've experienced in my career. There's an initial fear, and people are kind of like just a little bit anxious, not really knowing how it may play out. Then there's almost kind of like wow, I could get used to this. For many people, no commute. Maybe they get an extra hour or two sleep a week, which everybody needs, and just the flexibility of being able to kind of like maybe design the day. And I think all those things were great. And that honeymoon period of feeling a level of kind of freedom from the workplace, I think most people maybe have experienced that. But then the realities of balancing home life, school life, work life, then Zoom fatigue, just going from one call to the next call to the next call, and not moving. In the workplace, we move from office to office. We walk. So whilst it's had some upsides and some kind of levels of freedom, I think we all have to really balance that side of it as well, so we don't become office couch potatoes and we're just sat there on calls all day.
That idea of sort of designing your day, I find interesting, because in a way, like, typical office work life designs the day for you, right? There's a schedule, and you, like you said, you have to hit the road at a certain time to get there, get to work on time, and be to in a given place for particular duration. You take all of that out, and all of a sudden all of the responsibility is on you to schedule your day. And then there's also the freedom that comes with it to really like ask yourself, like, when am I most productive? Like, when am I most creative? And then fit that around your work life.
Yeah. I think as humans as well, we like maps. And I guess we could go to the paintings in the caves. We like some kind of visual or something that allows us and tells us and instructs us where to go. Now, during a work day, maybe an agenda. We're very wired to look at our lives like that. And we all jump in our cars now and put in an address in Google Maps. And we don't need to look at that traditional map. In the context of how we're working today, that discipline has maybe not been presented to us in the same way. We're working, living, playing within the same four walls. It almost feels like 24 hours a day. How do we design that day to make sure that we know when to turn a few things off and have some think time as well?
Yeah, it can be a real challenge to kind of build walls between like the separate parts of your day. And all of a sudden you can find yourself sort of never really shutting off from work and never really stopping and never fully engaging with that other side of your life if you aren't careful about it.
Yeah. I guess due to our ancestors, we're 9-to-5ers. We're 5 days a week. And I think there's something around one of the upsides of COVID is I feel more task orientated now, not time orientated. So if I get the chance, I want to start at 10, I will. If I finish at 7 p.m., I will. It's really about, what do I want to try and accomplish today? What do I need to accomplish? And it's not necessarily driven by the 8 hours and an hour for lunch. I think many people will come out of this situation with maybe a new approach, reinventing how we work and subsequently reinventing how we live at the same time.
I agree. And I think it's a challenge for employers, right, to kind of like let go of that old structure and realize that, you know, employees and workers are learning about themselves right now. Like they're learning about, you know, I've learned that I'm most productive between the hours of like 6 a.m. and 11 a.m. And so as an employer, like that's valuable information, right? And you can kind of let your employees dictate, you know, when are they going to give you their best work, when are they most productive, and there's a certain amount of letting go of control and you know, trusting, you know, your teams to, you know, handle that schedule for themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all been forced to trial this. I see 2020 as a trial for the next decade. We had no option, and so when everybody's doing that same thing, we're almost double dutying all day. Whether that's the children online, the dogs barking, the baby's crying, and you're trying to work at the same time. Those challenges. How productive can we be? Are we better or are we worse? And ultimately, for a business and a you know, kind of an entity, a commercial entity, does that make for a disconnected culture, a stronger bottom line? Are we more productive? You know, but at the same time, where's the special magic that we used to have when we used to just stop by somebody's office, have a chat about the game at the weekend or the movie or something, and just that kind of interaction? What does that look like in the future as well?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about, you know, some moments from your career where you experienced, you know, major changes in the world, whether they were, you know, socioeconomic or just shifts in, you know, technology and things like that. So I wonder, are there any sort of brands or cultural figures from the past that you sort of look to as points of inspiration or as a model of handling this kind of change well?
I take a lot from music, especially as a teenager, as a young adult, about to kind of like move into, but the way that certain musicians or movements, certain styles, genres of music can actually reflect and almost be the voice in many ways of that particular moment in time. And then with that, how a band, in my eyes, are still a brand, would evolve both musically as well as their image, their identity, album cover to album cover, their style. And I was always taken in by the fact that certain musicians can last 20, 30, 40 years, while others kind of tend to come and go. So what's that? How do they manage to survive? Is it just that they just keep playing the classics, or are they constantly pushing themselves to seek change and try something new that maybe is outside of their particular comfort zone, but it allows them to stay somewhat relevant in terms of, you know, from a kind of a general population perspective, and almost in many ways take on new waves of fans every decade as people start to listen to their music.
Yeah. Are there any examples that come to mind or that you really look to as, like, you know, different representations of either the play the classics or the innovative, you know, change your sound model?
Well, it's interesting. I think the classics for me as a young man of obviously being from the UK, the Beatles would be a great example of being able to change their style, their image, their clothing, their haircuts, their musical influences, and the way that they collaborated. And then, of course, that at a certain point in time, the Beatles were no more. But as individuals, as artists, they had a second career individually, and so I was always inspired, I guess, by that. And then as a kind of a early teenager, I think the punk rock scene or movement in the UK and maybe other parts of the world as well was starting to have a big effect on all teenagers, and it was kind of like the voice of a generation, and just being able to express yourself in a way that maybe was not necessarily accepted in society at the time, but it was a cry for help, and it was also done in a way that actually provided a level of inspiration, entertainment, visual. We talk about kind of being fearless and curious, and these words of today from a corporate standpoint, and there was a lot of those words embedded in those types of movements as well, where it was really just exploring something completely new. And if it didn't work, they'd move on to something else. So I think music as a whole, whichever genre anybody may be interested in, has probably got some really interesting proof points of how that category has been able to evolve.
Yeah, music's an interesting comparison because you have artists or groups that can spend sort of 30 years interpreting the same perspective or the same general sound in different ways, whether they switch the way, they go from, a more analog band to a more electronic band, but it's still the same sort of like core sound and song structure. Or you have artists that just reinvent themselves completely every album.
Absolutely. And they create the impression on our minds and our memories and our kind of hearts and minds. I think in the current world where we're not going to concerts, where we're not necessarily seeing new material coming out. We're seeing people at home, and it's how do we, in that notion of being behind a screen, that lack of interactivity with an audience and at a concert or even in a meeting, just that way that everything's having to adjust as a result of that. Whereas before, I remember when I was younger, I was very scared of public speaking. As an introvert, I it was a fear of mine, but in a way that, and I wouldn't ever compare myself to a great musician, but I plucked up the courage to go on stage, to say a few things about design, to talk about maybe some of the projects I'd worked on. And it was just that kind of adrenaline feeling afterwards that I pushed myself through it. Now, what does that look like in a current state where you're really just staring at a green light on your laptop? And most people are muted, so you don't get any reaction from the audience per se, because everybody's on a mute. You can't over exaggerate your hand gestures because it would look a little bit crazy and can seem frenetic. So all these kind of things from the real live environment, whether you're on stage or in the room, to this now virtual space, having to be sort of thought about in completely new ways.
Yeah, I think I'm feeling some of that right now, to be honest, because I'm not a huge fan of public speaking myself. And yet here we are recording a podcast, and I'm cringing a bit at the thought of people listening to me. But I think, talking about, again, some of these musicians or bands, and then, thinking bigger about, creative worker, designers, even writers, and then certainly brands, there's maybe one of the common themes is a willingness to fail a little bit in the name of trying something new.
And creative individuals, creative teams, creative families and organizations have just got this natural ability to not be scared of that failure, because you could always screw up the piece of paper and draw something different. And so I think, in many other organizations where it's a little bit more, there's a right way and a wrong way. And so therefore it's more of a textbook operational failure was seen as, that's not the way we do it. We will do it this way. Where I think for the past few years, organizations have been speaking about this, fail fast and iterate and be curious and all those kind of what appear to be on-trend C-suite terminology today. I think to creatives, musicians, artists, designers, creativity comes in all forms. I think that's just a natural way of thinking and doing that has been kind of part of their individual, certainly mine, and not scared of that change, not scared of that we call it failure, but it's really just moving on to the next version, if you like, whether that's musically or visually.
Yeah,
it's really just a kind of a next chapter of what you did earlier.
I agree. I think that intimacy of critique is maybe uncomfortable for people who are outside the creative field. The idea of being okay with imperfection as a step toward something permanent is a little bit uncomfortable.
Right. I mean, if the HR of the future builds in imperfection, failure as a positive at the, let's call it a quarterly or a year-end performance review, because I think that's also one of the things that people would be seeing as well. If I'm showing that I'm failing, then how's that going to affect my one-on-one with my manager? So that has to be something that's embraced from the organization, and actually rethink and redesign how some of those perceived failures have actually moved us forward.
Yeah. We talked earlier about this difference between reactive and proactive change. So with so many people, being forced into a reactive response to what's happening in the world or what has happened in the world, how do you feel like they can make that shift from, a reactive posture to something that's more proactive, where they're not scared so much about failure and they're more looking at, the landscape as it is and trying to find opportunities and chase after them?
I do tend to look at patterns from the past. I was only reading last week about the great London plague, and Sir Isaac Newton then, as a 23-year-old student studying at university, was sent home to quarantine, and so as was everybody. But it was during that time that he kind of studied and wrote the laws of gravity and other things to do with color and the prism and these things that maybe you think, wow, that was world changing. I mean, that literally, for someone who was sent home to work from home and kind of could have sat there, but well, maybe he did, and the apple dropped in his lap. But this idea where you can find these moments of solitude as a designer, as a creative. There's something around just being able to daydream, doodle, zone out or stare out of the window and relearn how to be creative again, in the same way that we all were when we were 5, 6, 7 years old. And this is a great opportunity for us to kind of rethink how, that those important elements of being a young child, where creativity was around them and no idea was a bad idea, but essentially coming back to that place. But now, obviously, with the benefit of being professionals, and we have individually we have jobs to do, but at the same time, bringing some of those patterns and those things that we remember back into our world to allow us to kind of rethink and repeat, rinse and repeat, maybe something that's gone on in the past in our own lives or in somebody else's life, to kind of take this situation and really make the most of it.
Yeah. Well, and maybe one of the patterns is that occasionally we need a shock to the system so that you can step back and be like, there's a lot we can do better. It can be as simple as the way we work. It could be as simple as, are we paying enough attention to our families? Do we need to reevaluate that? And so, that might in and of itself be a pattern. These shocks happen and we step back and reevaluate.
Absolutely. I at the end of the Second World War in the 1950s, I wasn't around, but I look at the way that, in the US particularly, there was almost kind of this industry boom. And whether that was through kind of the economy itself, but also as a designer, I'm looking at how, the automotive industry, the architectural design, product design, kitchen design, everything was kind of all of a sudden those dark days of the World War, and industry started to come back. And then the decade that followed that seemed to be, a very interesting period to live in. So beyond the clouds, this kind of rainbow appeared where now history will not repeat itself exactly the same, but you can see the potential of there being significant growth, significant creatively a boom decade in a way, not just the way we work, but maybe things that might redesign, rethink, and place things in our world that help us in different ways. But as a creative scene, I'm excited by that particular. And again, if you look at how the Second World War led us to that kind of a decade of prosperity and creativity, I'm hoping that level of history might repeat itself again.
And of course, the flip side is that if you're waiting for, a paradigm shift or a shock to kind of change things, if you're too comfortable with what works, then sometimes once that shock comes, it's sort of too late for you to change. So
yeah, and I think within any organization, certainly as a designer, I'm sure there's the 70% of what you're working on is probably relevant to the market in front of you, the here and the now, the next 12 months. Because you have a brand or a product or a campaign, and that's essentially you're delivering that, you're activating that. But maybe there's 20% of the thinking goes out a little bit further, 2 or 3 years out, and none of us can see that far. And 10% is a decade out, and certainly none of us can see that far. But there is at least a little bit of a space in either your brain or your team's time to be able to think simply beyond the here and now, to have a degree of experimentation, trial and error. It brings back the failure potentially it will fail, but it may just lead you somewhere else. So if it's all focused on the next 6 months, 12 months, and let's face it, everybody's kind of to a degree in survival mode, as I mentioned. So, most people are focused there right now, and potentially quite rightly. But at the same time, how do we think about our business 3 years out and 5 years out? And what does the future model look like in any given sector, in any given market? And how are we thinking about that today, even though it's not a reality today?
So earlier you mentioned people needing a map, to get through what's happening. What do you see as the role of creatives in sort of bridging the gap between people who need a map, who want things laid out for them, in moments like this, of moments of change and moments of evolution, and people who don't need that map and who are comfortable just kind of, experimenting, innovating, winging it? Like, is there a role at organizations for creatives and kind of bringing those two sides together?
Absolutely. And I think it's you need both. I think you need the map reader, and you need someone who's open to wandering and going off the beaten track. And I think that is a very simple pairing, and that could be individuals or departments or even brands or functions within a larger organization, to allow it to kind of almost bring opposites together, so you have that kind of memory structure, or at least that idea of knowing where this path will take us, but at the same time occasionally stepping off that and being brave enough to explore something that maybe the map wouldn't send you there. I think if you're completely off the map, then that's a high risk strategy as well, because you may land on something that's ultimately fantastic, but you also may not result in any level of kind of significant growth that affects the business. If you're always on the map, I remember some great lessons of coming through and working for the Coca-Cola Company, but it seemed to me every 4 years when there was an Olympics or a World Cup, which there were major global sponsors, there tended to be a kind of this is how we did it at the last World Cup. And that was 4 years earlier. And so for me, it was like 4 years in today's world is probably 2 decades in our grandparents' lifetime. And so much change has gone on in that period of time. The roadmap from 4 years ago should not necessarily be the roadmap we take for this next activation.
Yeah, 2016 feels like a distant memory. So it's hard to really feel that anything that was relevant or that made sense in 2016 feels relevant or makes sense now. Like, what is what we did 4 years ago, and not just any 4 years ago, but these 4 years ago? What does that tell us about what to do now? It seems sort of ridiculous.
Absolutely. But what's really interesting and exciting is how many new business models may flow as a result of this crazy year and this experimental year. I mean, I'm just waiting, this idea of us being online all day. I'm so now emotionally connected to those platforms because I see them every day. more than my kids sometimes. So, the next level of that, I'd be waiting for Zoom to, um, because they know my meetings, they know the gap, they know I have an hour and a half over a certain time. They know my profile. I just click one button, yes, sushi for lunch, and so in other words, that's probably not nowhere near where they would like to go. But you almost can see how brands and entities can start to kind of literally expand left and right beyond their kind of core proposition, their core product, to embed themselves even further in our lives.
Well, that's a good point because you mentioned this idea of, being on the map, being off the map, and trying to, maintain some balance. And I feel like you mentioned this earlier, this idea of, missing those those spontaneous in-person conversations or bumping into someone in the hallway. And, I feel like what we're missing now is all of that spontaneity where with Zoom and other online meeting platforms, everything needs to be scheduled, which means it needs to be thought of in advance. And the possibility of, a conversation sort of going in an unexpected direction is reduced. So, how can, what do you see as like a way for creative professionals to kind of replicate that or at least find a substitute?
Well, I think partly, one thing that may come out of this, and certainly something I'm focused on at the moment, is just this idea of it being a global community. So our communities used to be at the workplace, and we'd see each other, kind of walk into the canteen or stopping off and saying hi, and that interaction is important. How does that interaction work in a very spontaneous way, in a virtual community where, and I know there's a couple of apps my kids use. I think it's called House Party, where you just drop in and hang out and then kind of like, leave when it feels the right time to leave. And I think things like that are definitely right now possibly more aimed at a teenage world, but actually how do things like that manifest in a more professional capacity? How can you just kind of drop in and say hi and sit with 5, 8, 12 people, have a conversation whilst you're having your lunch, and albeit digital, there may be from 5 or 6, 7 countries, all talking about a certain thing, whether that's the game at the weekend or a new typeface that's been launched and how people are using it. So I think that idea feels quite appealing.
And do you think it's sort of incumbent upon designers to rethink how they approach work or how they approach the search for work?
I think so. My whole career I've been obsessed with talent, and finding talent has probably been the most difficult part of my job description, either because I've been geographically in a part of the world that has not been a capital city. I grew up in Yorkshire. We had a studio in Huddersfield in the north of England. And quite honestly, most people go to London, they go to Paris, they'll go to New York. I think in a future state, those walls have been knocked down instantly. Mm-hmm. That talent can be anywhere in the world. And I think agencies could also use their talent as a way to kind of show the breadth and depth of talent that they have within their agency. A fantastic illustrator, she may live in a rural part of the world on a farm, with limited Wi-Fi, but no longer will she have to move to the big city. But just this idea now of being highly distributed, highly talented, and still on demand, in demand from wherever they may be. I think there's definitely something very exciting about that, and how people will decide upon where they will live and how that will affect everything from the workplace to buildings, real estate. Not everybody has to flood to these so-called capitals. It kind of makes the world a capital then, the entire world, and not just kind of these historical kind of culturally capital cities.
Of course, it comes with challenges too, right? Like you may be the best copywriter in Boise, Idaho, but if you are applying, if you're pursuing work all over the world, then you're competing with the whole world. So, for creatives, what's how do you manage that competition?
Yeah, I've always believed, and when we grew Attic, we always felt we would be more successful overseas than back home in the UK. In the early part of our careers, we were purely selling in our own market. As soon as we started to kind of like spread our wings and try and find some potential engagements overseas, I felt we all of a sudden appeared to be a little bit different. We had a different accent. We dressed differently. We had different stories from where we were from and how we grew up. And all those kind of like cultural nuances became actually very strong talking points. And I would say that for anyone. So if you're Brazilian, you're potentially more successful in China than in Brazil or North America or Europe. And whilst everybody could do that, I guarantee everybody won't, because there's just something that people, will potentially go back to a level of normality.
Well, yeah, and you made an interesting point where it's easy to kind of slip back into old habits, even if you kind of have a sense that there's not a lot of longevity there. So, it can be hard to see the value in something that isn't quite tangible, but seems like it's out there. So, how do you, and you're a good example, right? Because you were at Coca-Cola and you left to try something new. So what's your advice for people who are kind of, tempted by what's comfortable and tempted to just stick with what works, even if they know that there might be more out there or that they might need to make a change eventually, and want to do it proactively, but quite frankly are a little bit intimidated or scared?
Yeah, and I think that takes us back to the map reader and the wanderer, and it's difficult when you think about yourself, because you either want to go alone and go out into the wilderness without the map, or you want to stay on the map, and because I know where I'll be in 5 years, because this map tells me and the organization tells me. So that's absolutely a credible strategy as well. In a simple dynamic of a household, if both parents are working, one may be a little more kind of adventurous and the other one may be a little bit more grounded. So you've kind of got that balance of both. Now, life doesn't work like that. And quite often we find ourselves thinking of our own situations and how do I develop my career? I think what I've tried to do is have moments of map reading. Coca-Cola was a map reading 5 years for me. Mm-hmm. And it was crucially important for me to really learn and understand and spend time with some of the greatest marketeers, in the business. But then I felt then after that, there needs to be a moment of the unknown, the wandering, mapless, if you like. Who knows in 5 years' time? Maybe the map comes along again, but I think it's that kind of balance of, rather than relying on somebody else next to me, it's taking it in small chunks, if you like, or at least kind of like spurts of being surrounded by things, and you can really see my pathway right now in front of me, and then removing all that and that fear, and go back to that notion of survival again, very human instinct of being able to kind of like having the freedom, but also the fear of making it work, and I quite like that right now in my world. I like that idea of being slightly scared of things falling into place, and that actually makes me think, sharpens my thinking to make sure that the things I do during the day, hopefully will be of benefit in some way to someone.
Well, James, I want to thank you so much for coming on our show today. Do you want to let people know where they can learn a bit more about your work and what you're up to these days?
Thanks, Carl. No, absolutely. I hope that was useful. You can find me on Instagram and LinkedIn. Those are, I guess, my daily go-tos. And I would look out for anybody who pings me, and I'll look forward to connecting with them.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more about James Sommerville or listen to more of his English accent, head on over to monotype.com/resources for a video of James we produced earlier this year. And if you want to check out James Sommerville's work, look for a link to his website in the show notes of this episode. Finally, we want to hear from you. The best way to do that is to head over to Apple Podcasts to rate and review this episode. Even better, subscribe to the show and share it with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype and Christopher Sound. We'll be back with more episodes soon. See ya.